Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Connor. I'm joined by Michael Estrang, Harry Aga, and Chi Wang. Today, we'll be discussing how the United States should orient its foreign policy towards China. The world currently stands at a crossroads. As you well know, we face the return of great power conflict, divestment from the liberal world order, and existential challenges in the form of climate change. All of these pose a threat to the betterment of standards of living and life expectancy. However, with careful diplomacy and a bit of forethought, we can work with China to avoid the worst consequences of these challenges and emerge stronger than ever. As such, we have three primary goals. The first is pretty simple: avoid World War III or another Cold War. The second is to preserve a rules-based international order based on preserving sovereignty, UN order, free trade, and Taiwan's de facto autonomy. The third is to address shared global challenges like climate change and arms control. To accomplish these goals, we recommend limiting inflammatory rhetoric, increasing economic integration with China, and investing more into the international institutions while following the rule of law instead of subverting it. Pursuing this agenda will allow us to create stable relations with China, providing us with the latitude to forestall any change from the status quo on Taiwan and send officials to persuade them to do things like decommission coal power plants and work together on clean energy technology. Our administration has taken us in the right direction, but Secretary Antony Blinken's trip to China must be the beginning, not the end. That trip also demonstrated the shortcomings of current policy. We cannot ramp up support for Taiwan, create anti-China alliance networks in the Asia-Pacific, and preserve harsh trade restrictions on China, and simultaneously expect cooperation on the issues that matter to us. Instead, we must eliminate counterproductive rhetoric, antagonism, and Cold War parallels. Presuming conflict is inevitable precipitates that exact conflict. More to the point, integration with China is a positive-sum game. Not only have we benefited from integration with China, but our allies have as well. Forcing our allies to choose between us is both pointless and will only weaken our strategic position. This decisive decade is not something to win. Framing it as such inevitably leads to conflict. Finally, China faces substantial political and economic challenges in the next few years. Attempting to resolve the Taiwan problem is unnecessary and dangerous. By the time China may be willing to risk such aggressive action, its potential to take such action will be dramatically reduced. Over the next 20 minutes, we will assess China's ideology, military, and political economy, and compare that to where the United States stands, before diving into the details of our plan and explaining how it is best suited for creating the future that we all wish to live in. With that, we'll turn to a general assessment of China. In terms of ideology, we hold that China does not have global aggressive ambitions, as its track record shows. It has not gone to war since 1979 or used lethal military force abroad since 1988, a history that contrasts sharply with other great powers like the United States and Russia. This is due in part to the fact that China benefits massively from the current status quo. Over the last several decades, China has raised millions out of poverty, experienced an economic boom. These gains from the current world order have created a China that has historically a low tolerance for risk, meaning that we need only a relatively small stick to hold them off. Engagement with China has not failed. They are a responsible stakeholder for the international system, particularly compared to their belligerents in the 1970s, and there's no reason to think that this will change as they develop. Of course, it's worth recognizing that China does indeed have a history of using economic and military tools to get what it wants. This does not mean that confrontation would reduce these behaviors. If anything, Chinese behavior has shown that confrontation encourages them, playing into their fears of American containment. It's simply unrealistic to think that containment would stop their aggressive action. President Xi Jinping has stated that China must transform into a modern socialist nation, part of which includes becoming a global leader. Goals of economic prosperity and leadership are in direct tension with aggressive military action like taking Taiwan. Invading Taiwan would also constrict China's access to imports that it relies on, like oil, food, and semiconductors. So long as China is not backed into a corner, which is precisely what a hawkish plan attempts to do, they have as much incentive to preserve the status quo as we do. Given this assessment of China, we believe that the United States' foreign policy must resist the fearmongers that paint China as the next ideological Soviet Union. Now we'll turn to Michael with a military assessment of China.
Hi, I'm Michael Estrang, the military advisor, and I'll briefly assess the Chinese military's goals and capabilities before we explore potential American policy responses. First, we expect China will be averse to taking Taiwan by force because of the massive economic and human cost, as well as the sheer logistical difficulties of seizing an island whose population is firmly anti-China. China has historically been averse to economic, political, or military risk, and taking Taiwan puts decades of Chinese stability in these areas in jeopardy. Additionally, China's military is not as strong as China hawks make them out to be, particularly compared to the capabilities and strengths of the United States military. Although many analysts and experts, as well as war games and a recent RAND Corporation report suggest that China could seize Taiwan, the process would not be easy and would likely cause immense harm to the Chinese military during the initial invasion. China has not fought a conflict since their 1979 war with Vietnam and lacks the experience necessary to conduct a real-world amphibious assault of a well-armed island without suffering massive losses. Lastly, there is no evidence to suggest that China's military ambitions extend beyond the Asia-Pacific region. They are also surrounded by relatively wealthy and secure countries, further limiting hypothetical expansion. Next, we'll hear from Harry about China's position on alliances.
I'm Harry Aga, the American Indo-Pacific's Relations Advisor for Team A, and I'll briefly assess the Chinese position on alliance relations. As it stands, China does not have many close allies, either in the Indo-Pacific region or abroad. However, initiatives like the Belt and Road and Xi Jinping's major country diplomacy strategy could change that in the near future. China's top concern in the Indo-Pacific is isolation. Following this concern, it is fearful of a coordinated strategy that would prevent access to specialized technologies and resources. Additionally, the possibility of military engagement with the United States and its allies poses a legitimate security threat. That being said, China understands that an invasion of Taiwan would push neighboring countries away, so they are expected to be risk-averse in consideration of their relationships with other nations. A China that feels deliberately threatened or isolated may be willing to overstep boundaries of the rules-based international system. Thus, the United States must focus on balancing their alliance efforts with the concerns of China in mind. While it may be a difficult task to toe that line, it would prove to be beneficial for the stability of the region long-term. I'll now pass the floor over to Qi for an analysis on Chinese economic policy.
I'm Qi Wang, the Political Economic Advisor for Team A. I will now give a brief assessment of Chinese economy. Based on our best assessments of PRC's past policy pattern, China wants to maintain a stable regime without foreign intervention and continue securing the economic growth. Participating in a global economy will only benefit China to achieve these goals. Since PRC's then top leader Deng Xiaoping's opening up policy, China has burned foreign investment which help with their economic growth. China bans from cooperating with the United States and integration with the global economy. Apart from its economic prosperity, China also faces several problems that will lead to their decline. They face the middle income trap, a lack of job opportunities for both unskilled workers and college graduates, massive level of debts, natural resource degradation, and a rapidly aging population. They've also begun to experience some consequences of their rapid industrialization, which incentivize them to cooperate with the United States on those shared global challenges such as climate change. The bottom line is these challenges pose a potential threat in future Chinese growth and will encourage them to cooperate with the United States to stabilize their international positions and focus on their domestic issues. Now let's turn the floor to Michael for a detailed assessment of American military policy.
Now that we've briefly assessed the Chinese military's goals and capabilities, we will explore American military policy responses. In order to maintain peace in the Asia-Pacific without undermining our own security, American military policy should pursue three main goals. First, sell defensive weapons to Taiwan. Second, maintain strategic ambiguity by reducing inflammatory rhetoric and actions. And third, engage in negotiations on shared transnational military challenges. In order to bolster deterrence against the Chinese invasion, we should continue to engage in weapons sales to Taiwan. Specifically, we should support weapons deals that sell useful defensive technology such as mines, anti-ship missiles, anti-air missiles, and missile defense systems. Concentrating efforts on these weapons will allow Taiwan to maximize its spending efficiency and create the most effective deterrent against Chinese assault plans. Additionally, the United States should contract internet companies like Microsoft to assist in hardening Taiwan's civilian and military infrastructure against potential Chinese cyber attacks, which might precede an invasion. Microsoft had great success assisting Ukraine in its efforts to defend against Russian cyber attacks, and Taiwan stands to benefit from enhanced protection against PLA hackers. Finally, the United States should refuse to sell any offensive weaponry, like long-range missile systems that could be used to target the Chinese mainland, as this would be seen as an escalation by Beijing. We believe that upholding a policy of strategic ambiguity and generally limiting rhetoric around Taiwan is in the best interest of the United States, given that past statements and actions have needlessly strained relations between us and China. For example, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022, which carried very little substantive weight, was an unnecessary show of support that greatly angered China. Additionally, U.S. officials should carefully evaluate their declaratory policy and avoid making statements like President Biden did last summer, where he incorrectly stated that the United States military would come to Taiwan's defense, angering China and forcing the White House to issue a revised statement. Finally, the United States should generally avoid any and all rhetoric around Taiwan. Sometimes the best thing to say is nothing at all. The United States has a history of attempted negotiation with the PRC government, but many diplomatic efforts, including Secretary Blinken's recent visit to Beijing, have fallen short of achieving their goals. China does not respond well to aggression from the United States, which often stifles progress in negotiations. We believe that by taking a less hawkish posture and engaging with China across the board, the United States will have a better likelihood of making substantive progress on the following three issues. First, the United States should seek to reduce tensions in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait by pledging to end freedom of navigation exercises in the region, in exchange for China pledging to halt its incursions into Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea's air defense identification zones. Second, the United States and China should enter into arms control negotiations regarding the reduction of nuclear warhead stockpiles, with the aim of inviting Russia and other nuclear-armed nations to join as well. Lastly, the United States should seek to reopen lines of communication between military leaders that were severed after former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan last summer. Although Secretary Blinken was not successful in reopening these lines of communication during his recent state visit, we believe the PRC will be more open to negotiations on this topic if the United States takes a less militaristic and aggressive posture. These strategies will help the United States and China begin to ease tensions and open dialogue, while also ensuring that Taiwan has the weaponry and technology necessary to deter, and if required, defend itself from a Chinese invasion. Finally, it's worth mentioning how military hawkishness leads to an increased risk of a costly war. Specifically, escalating tensions and embracing inflammatory rhetoric will not deter conflict, but instead will push us closer to the precipice of war with China. Each time the United States conducts a military drill in the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait, there's a heightened risk of miscommunication or miscalculation, and one single accident could potentially be the spark that brings both countries to war. Escalation, especially increasing military buildup, only raises the stakes of war, as both sides will have larger weapon stockpiles. Additionally, rhetoric that is often parroted by China hawks increases feelings of hostility among Chinese officials and citizens alike, bolstering anti-American sentiment and aiding in Chinese nationalism. Lastly, it is worth recognizing that a war with China would be unlike any conflict the United States has entered in the last 75 years. China is a nuclear-armed state with a competent, powerful, and technologically advanced military that would pose unique challenges to American military leaders. A potential conflict could have disastrous outcomes, and the potential for loss of life is something that should not be taken lightly. Next, we'll hear from Harry about American alliances.
I'll now be discussing American policy towards alliance relations in the Indo-Pacific. America's policy with regard to its allies should follow three guiding principles: maintain the credibility of our protection and support to our allies, invest in multilateral arrangements and organizations, and facilitate Chinese acceptance of regional affairs and American conduct. In maintaining credibility, effective economic and military policy will be essential in communicating that America is a reliable and powerful actor to have as an ally. With regards to military arrangements, the United States should increase their troop deployments to South Korea and Japan. However, this should proceed as a symbolic measure. This will simultaneously reassure Japan and South Korea of our commitment, while also assuring China that the United States does not pose an immediate security threat to them. This increase in troop deployment should stay between 1,000 to 3,000 troops, which is the size of a standard United States regiment. The U.S. should continue conducting defensive drills with Australia, South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. However, they must not be provocative towards China. For example, the Blikaton, an annual drill between the Philippines and the United States, is consistently criticized by China for being deliberately offensive, as it features significant urban operations and live-fire naval exercises. Furthermore, the drill is conducted in the northern Philippines island of Luzon, only 280 miles away from Taiwan. As a policy, drills should not encroach on China. They should remain defensive with no simulations of a mainland offensive or a carrier takedown. Furthermore, the U.S. should maintain aid and multilateral agreements with our allies. This includes pre-existing mutual defense treaties and arms sales agreements. These military policies would reassure our allies that they are protected by the U.S., that our allies won't feel compelled to acquire nuclear weapons. With regards to economic arrangements, the United States should continue to enhance economic ties with our allies through expanded trade agreements, including the existing free trade agreement treaties signed with Australia, Japan, and South Korea, as well as the 2022 Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. In addition, the United States should increase their investments in both civilian and military applications at our allies. This would entail military installations and funding for civilian infrastructure. Furthermore, the U.S. should explore the possibility of more substantial multilateral economic projects with our allies. This would involve coordinated infrastructure projects that facilitate more efficient trade throughout the region that would make America the more desirable partner. Additionally, a strong effort must be made to invest in the international order and multilateral arrangements relevant to the Indo-Pacific. The United States should assess treaties and agreements that it is not currently a party of and make an effort to sign on to communicate to allies that we are going to be a strong, reliable partner. This includes the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Pacific Agreement on Closer Economic Relations. In addition, the United States should reinvest in several Indo-Pacific institutions, such as the Asia Development Bank, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. This will demonstrate good faith and legitimate American interest in the success of our partners in the region. The U.S. should also increase its commitment to the UN and other international bodies in the Indo-Pacific, such as the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, as well as the IMF's Asia-Pacific Regional Office. Strategic arrangements, including the Quad and AUKUS, are valuable to the United States. As such, America should strengthen their role in these organizations. This would mean more summits, funding, and multilateral cooperations in areas such as global health, climate change, and cybersecurity. These enhanced ties will provide America with greater influence in the region. Through the regional investments and policies proposed, America will be in a far better position regarding its involvement in the international system and regional affairs. Our final goal in facilitating Chinese acceptance without compromising America's interest will ensure stability in the region and help avoid conflict. It is important to not alienate or anger China. Doing so would make the government feel more isolated and aggressive while also playing into the agenda of nationalists within the country. First of all, we must recognize that our allies will engage with China through trade. We should not get in the way of this, and in fact should be welcoming of this relationship. Greater economic connection will only stabilize the region. Second of all, the United States should explore new avenues for Chinese-American cooperation, either through more interactions with pre-existing institutions and agreements, or potentially new initiatives. The G20, the U.S.-China Joint Commission on Trade and Commerce, and the U.S.-China Climate Change Working Group are effective mechanisms for bilateral cooperation between the two nations. In the future, China and the United States can work towards establishing new working groups and bodies, as well as promoting civil societies focused on social and cultural ties, such as the Asia Society's Center on U.S.-China Relations. Keeping China ingrained in the international system will be a net positive for both China and the United States. To strengthen America's relationship with its allies while also keeping China satisfied is difficult, but with the implementation of effective policy, it will pay off. This is what makes our approach towards alliance relations the stronger choice. Under this approach, we'll be better equipped to address shared global challenges. I'll now pass it off to Chi, who will discuss economic policy.
I will now give a detailed American economic strategy. The American economic policy should pursue three main goals. The first is peace. For the United States, this means avoid World War III and preserving a rule-based international order. The second is prosperity. This looks at free trade and economic growth, which can be a win-win. Finally, we have protection. The United States should increase foreign immigration and protect American business and military interests through IP protection and onshoring semiconductor facilities. Let's talk about how to achieve peace. Because China's unique social contract, which promised its people economic growth in exchange for a more repressive form of governance, Xi Jinping is likely to put domestic economic growth and stability above other goals like taking Taiwan. Economic interconnection then will further consolidate peace in the Indo-Pacific. The United States should approach the goals of preserving peace and order in three ways. First, the United States should negotiate bilateral trade agreements with China and other Indo-Pacific trade agreements involving China. The open communication between the United States and China can establish fair international rules that China respects and will later follow. Second, the United States should cooperate with China on shared global challenges, such as climate change. When two nations seek common ground rather than stressing on conflicts, it forms the foundation for peaceful coexistence. Third, not only should we seek common ground, it is also important to respect differences between the two nations. The United States should respect the Communist Party's rule in China and tolerate alternative ideologies other than Western ideologies. Publicly advocating for regime change will only foster resentment. As Deng Xiaoping once said, it doesn't matter whether a cat is white or black as long as it catches mice. By conducting this approach, we provide incentives for China to achieve what it wants through cooperation. Next, to achieve economic prosperity, the United States should secure the centrality of United States dollars in the global financial system. Securing other countries' dependence on the dollar. Recently, the Chinese yuan has overtaken the dollar as the most used currency in China's cross-border transactions. Better relations with China will aid in securing the centrality of the dollar. This leads to our second point. We should lift trade sanctions on China, especially in the non-military high-level technology field. Free trade is a positive sum game for both nations. For the United States, lifting sanctions on China can demonstrate friendliness, which will reduce PRC's aggression, prevent future challenges in the centrality of the dollar, and increase American firms' access to Chinese market. The United States can expect China to reduce its regulatory favoritism toward domestic firms in exchange for the United States to drop sanctions on China. The United States model of free trade, which it has championed for decades, has led to growth and prosperity. U.S.-China trade agreements has also been a boom for the Chinese economy and led to job growth. Furthermore, the United States should establish greater global economic integration, such as an American Belt and Road Initiative. This economic policy is not centered around countering China, but it will help the United States win continuing cultural support around the world. The advanced technology the United States can provide will help to create a stronger bond around its economic allies than the China's Belt and Road Initiative can. Finally, to protect American interests, the United States should first encourage Chinese students, scientists, and their family to work and live in America. This will ensure our technology advancement, foster cultural connection, and boost our economy. Second, onshore semiconductor facilities from Taiwan to the United States to ensure we maintain access to high-level semiconductor production. Third, safeguard the intellectual property of American companies from foreign theft. As early as 2015, then President Barack Obama and President Xi struck a deal that neither the United States nor the Chinese government will conduct cyber-enabled theft of intellectual property. China is willing to take a quid pro quo approach dealing with intellectual property. This deal only fell apart following Trump taking office and his anti-China rhetoric. By implementing this economic policy, the United States can achieve our three primary goals. Now, Ben will conclude Team A's American foreign policy.
With the details behind how our plan should be executed established, it's worth taking a moment to expand upon a substantial strength of our plan: flexibility. While the historical evidence demonstrates a China able and willing to cooperate with the United States when our interests are aligned, if China ultimately rebuffs our attempts at cooperation, our strategy still places us in a position from which we can effectively respond. Many of the changes we suggest simply make us more safe overall. We give up on rhetoric that did nothing to increase the security of ourselves or our allies, while investing in regional partners and international institutions that can counter a belligerent China. We gain the opportunity to forge peace and cooperation without compromising on what really matters: security. Our strategy provides similar flexibility if China continues to grow and doesn't struggle as much as we predict it will. You can always increase confrontation. That's easy. It's much harder, but much more potentially rewarding, to be careful and take a cooperation-first approach. Taking an aggressive posture gives up addressing the shared challenges of the world while risking war. It is short-sighted and reactionary. I'd like to take a moment to remind you all of the three goals that we established at the outset of this presentation. We seek to avoid World War III, preserve a rules-based international order, and address shared global challenges. The strategy that we've laid out is our best chance of success in these goals, and their failure would be catastrophic. While we've addressed the risk of war, the economic decline that would accompany decoupling and the environmental consequences of failing to cooperate on an issue like climate change would be disastrous. In the 1980s, Japan was on the receiving end of many of the growth and economic complaints that China now receives, about fears from overtaking the US in GDP to IP theft and regulatory favoritism. Those fears proved to be overblown. As Japan developed, its interests increasingly aligned with upholding the international rule of law, as it developed patents of its own and its population stagnated. China is on a similar track. Its development incentives push it to uphold stability, and its population is in decline. We cannot allow fear-mongering to push us towards unnecessary confrontation. There's no reason to allow the things that do divide us to push us apart. China seeks the political and economic stability that is good not just for our two nations, but for the world. These aligned incentives have the potential to be a trailblazer for cooperation on climate change, arms control, and technological progress. The United States is resilient and growing, improved not through competition or conflict against China, but through integration with China. We have strength and time enough to seek peace. Thank you all for your time.
Okay, I will start with our experts.
I went first last time, so
Okay.
why don't you go?
So I have a question on the military side. You described China as risk averse. You described China as not as ambitious as we've made them out to be, seek the kind of regional military expansion that people are worried about. And you described China as being very aware of all of the military problems it would face in trying to attack Taiwan. You also say that China is sensitive to U.S. military moves, so we have to be very careful about what military forces we put in the region, how we train and cooperate with allies, how we drill, and so on and so forth. So why not just get out, right? Why shouldn't the U.S. deal with military drills at all? Why should we send military forces to our allies at all? If we follow the logic of your presentation, we should retrench. We should remove American military forces from East Asia, right? China's not going to go on the offensive anyway, you've established that. And we would prevent a security dilemma. We wouldn't accidentally scare China into a war. So why not just reduce the U.S. footprint?
Well, a large part of our policy is actually retrenchment. So we were pledging to end a lot of our end all of our freedom of navigation exercises in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait, as these are actions that we view as needlessly escalatory. However, we do want to have a bit of wiggle room in case we're wrong, right? And that's one of the things that a lot of people who take that sort of approach will get criticized for. It says, what if you're wrong? What if China is actually ambitious? And so that's why, as a backup, as Harry talked about, we would have the increased troop presence in South Korea, in Japan, and maintain a lot of those strategic partnerships with our regional allies. So we indicate that we're willing to act in good faith, pull back a little bit, and then we can go from a place where we can kind of reevaluate how does China respond, and then maybe go from there, maybe choose to retrench even further if China does appear to be cooperating. And if they don't, then we maintain our presence in the region.
What do the regiments do, these two land-based army regiments actually accomplish?
I mean,
They seem provocative without having any practical use.
yeah. So I mean, typically, sorry.
Very small.
Yeah. So typically, like, if there is some sort of, I guess you could say, disorganization or some sort of chaos in a neighboring nation that is partnered with the United States, we'll send a regiment or some sort of diplomatic force over to our allied nation to show that the United States is still out there, still maintaining a presence, and that we have like the logistical means to send over soldiers. In the case of South Korea and Japan, you know, typically we do send some additional troops on like rotational. Sometimes we pull back a little bit, but that sort of like size right there of like a single regiment, you know, that can be very communicative in terms of the fact that we have the means to send it over. We have, again, done these rotationals in which we have sent additional regiments at times, pulled back additional regiments. China has responded in a pretty lukewarm manner. Of course, any presence of American soldiers in the region is going to upset them, but very minor additions are not going to anger China while also communicating to our allies that we have the means of sending soldiers over there.
So I'm trying to think. I'm going to ask a question that's sort of the flip side of Josh's, but not exactly. That speaks to the what if we're wrong. So let's stipulate that everything that, I take on board everything you said factually about the past. But we also know from other lessons of the past that as countries' strength increases and as powers rise, so do their appetites quite often, and their expectations and their willingness to have other actors in the region. So, for instance, Great Britain had to make a hard decision in 1895 about whether to decide to stay in the Western Hemisphere and have a war with the growing United States, or whether to depart. They decided to depart. So the question is, so we could have this preemptively decide, essentially, retrenchment is the answer, and we're moving out of the Chinese, well, let's say, what would become the Chinese sphere of influence, though we don't like to use those terms anymore. But that also sends all sorts of signals. And what if their view towards how they think about international politics and the China of the future, as their strength grows, assuming it does, right, and their appetites grow, what if we're wrong? We're really wrong. Here's the question. What are the potential consequences, and how quickly can we unwind a less aggressive or a sort of more passive approach to the rising China? I couldn't quite tell from your slides whether or not this is something where we just essentially go from having a very small troop presence, sub-brigade size, to, yes, we'll have these other troops available that we can move from over the horizon back into the region, and that might be escalatory. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now talk about in a more macro sense, and over the longer term, what might be the consequences of a conciliatory approach? And might this be the flip side of the spiral model, but rather the deterrence model in play, whereby we don't need to worry, China's just doing what great powers do, and they take a little more, they take a little more, and they take a little more, and suddenly we've got a big problem.
I can take the beginning of that question, and then, of course, we're all welcome to chip in. I would start by saying that a lot of the policies that we're recommending don't undo what are our greatest strategic assets in the region. We're maintaining and strengthening a lot of the relationships that we have with Japan and South Korea. And we believe that by sort of staying in the region and not entirely abandoning it, we still do have the flexibility to come back and push back against a China that continually pushes beyond its borders.
And we're going to be investing enough at home as a contingency?
Yeah, what do you mean by investing?
Well, just saying an alternative approach to, a hypothetical alternative approach to all of this would essentially say we need to plan for or hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And what I understood from your presentation, and I may have missed it, is that you're planning for and preparing for the best. Not completely walking away, but it assumes a rosier future than some other folks are anticipating. And so turning around on a dime, to use a aircraft carrier metaphor, like you can't simply decide to reverse course immediately. So how long would it take? What are the implications? So maintaining strategic partnerships is not quite the same thing as saying we have the assets back at home if we have to come back.
I think our response to that would be that we don't view preparing for the worst can often be taken as planning for the worst. And if we decide we're going to massively revamp our military and do all of these aggressive actions, more along the lines of what a Team B approach would be, that can be very easily interpreted as, oh, they're not just preparing for the worst, they're going to contain us. And I think that's what we're trying to mitigate with our approach. If we do have to turn around, that will require, a substantial investment of resources, but we won't be in such a position that it won't be possible. So in order to hope for the best and for a path to the best to still exist, we can't, expect war. We can't, fully put all of our money into our military.
So it's kind of a Glazer-esque, if we're actually going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're not going to essentially say that the realism necessitates.
Right, we want to communicate.
Aggression, we need to signal that we are actually about.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right.
How does your approach differ at all from the U.S. approach to China in the 1990s all the way up to the 2010s?
There is a degree to which it doesn't. I think we view that period of time in which China became less belligerent. China stopped funding terrorist groups overseas. China stopped being militarily aggressive and was willing to engage in the international system. China is a responsible stakeholder. There are problems with their current style of engagement, and we want to work with international institutions to mitigate those. We can't have a great power in the Indo-Pacific bullying all of its neighbors, and we want to work with those nations and institutions like the UN to make sure that there is a sort of safety mechanism in place in case they do start taking those kinds of actions. But it's not strikingly different from our policy at that time. We want to invest in international institutions to restrain them and respect the rule of law ourselves more than we might have at that time period. But it isn't a total roundabout change from our course of action.
The first time, I did this notion that our policy succeeded from the 90s up to the recent past. It doesn't pass the giggle test. China has undertaken a massive military expansion. China is claiming ownership over most of maritime East Asia. It's completely befuddling legal claims. It's building naval and air bases to expand its reach. It's massively improving its military, conventional, and nuclear capabilities, right? And it's being much more belligerent diplomatically than we or anybody else is. It even has a word for its wolf warrior diplomacy. So why in the world would we want to go back and replicate our past approach?
I would say that a lot of that escalation has been in recent years, and it's been in response to increased escalation from the United States. So there was a statement from a Chinese general in 2014 that said that part of the reason why they're conducting the military bases in the South China Sea is because of U.S. free move navigation exercises where we're sailing warships through the South China Sea, which is unnecessary. And so it is because of our escalation that China has been taking these steps, not because of attempts to be diplomatic and negotiate with them.
International waters. China has no right to complain about that. We're not sailing through Chinese territorial waters.
China's not sailing warships off like 100 miles off of Florida or off the east coast of the United States. And I think if they did something like that, the United States would not respond favorably to that either. And it just seems like a needlessly provocative move that's boxing China into a corner where they feel like the only recourse to get out of that situation is to increase their escalatory rhetoric and to say, hey, we are willing to stand up for ourselves.
We're providing, in some ways, China the opportunity to say, you're complaining about our actions and you're complaining about our military aggressiveness in the region. And you say you're willing to be a cooperative partner with us if we own up to our word and pursue less aggressive policies. We're providing a path that avoids war and conflict. And that's what we're trying to do. We're taking them at their word and hoping that they'll take us at ours and owning up to that.
So semi-relatedly, but moving to a slightly different realm, following your logic, if we embrace the idea of tolerance and not pushing back against escalatory rhetoric and toning down some of our own rhetoric, do we perhaps set up some perverse incentives to encourage more human rights abuses domestically and more repression, given that China has to potentially worry about the situation domestically? If you essentially say, live and let live, you do you, we're going to do us, because we're eager to avoid war, and as long as we can agree on the basic rules of the road, whether the cat's white or black.
I want to address first the point about like human rights abuses inside of China. I think taking a militaristic approach actually does the very opposite of what you're talking about. If we increase tensions with them, they're going to be way less willing to negotiate with the United States on human rights issues, say the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in the west of the country. And so by taking this more diplomatic approach, by opening up lines of dialogue and communications on other issues, we get our foot in the door where we can start to work with the CCP. And then once we've established these good faith negotiations, we can say, hey, what about these other issues? But we won't have
They have a history of essentially saying, we don't believe in domestic interference, right? So let's stipulate that I think you're right, that if we escalate, they will escalate, but I don't quite see how we get from us not escalating to them not doing what they want to do domestically, particularly when they've made it very clear we believe in sovereignty with a big S, and what happens inside our country to preserve our security is none of your business, and stay out. So, I need a little bit more about how increasing dialogue is going to encourage them to adopt a different approach.
The thing I think really seals this for us is the failure of yelling at China. As much as we may want to, go at China and say, there are all of these human rights abuses happening in your country. There are all of these horrible things you're doing. You're a dictator. I think Biden has been quoted as calling Xi a dictator. And as much as that may feel good to do, it doesn't tend to accomplish a lot. Instead, China ramps up aggression against the U.S., or China releases a report detailing, killings by the police in the U.S. So what we've found over the last few years is that yelling at China and trying to increase conflict over these issues hasn't been effective. So that path isn't viable in terms of changing human rights. And pursuing a more cooperative approach and maybe trying to develop better relations with the country has a better chance than just simply yelling at China from the sidelines and critiquing them.
I could just follow up on that real quick. At the end of the day, are you willing to accept the reality that maybe the United States just has to say absolutely nothing about China's internal affairs? You know, you're holding out, well, maybe there's hope, maybe we can work with them. At the end of the day, I mean, the premise that I think you guys defended about engagement was it really wasn't all about changing China's internal system, it was about changing their external behavior. Do you still believe that principle is valid, which is we need to go back to the days where China didn't comment about George Floyd and police brutality, and we don't talk about internal stuff, or at least not in a loud voice or something that gets in the way of practical negotiations?
Yeah, well, I think a significant part of our whole argument here is like the strengthening of the international system as well. Those other bodies such as the UN and stuff, when it comes to more of those domestic human rights abuses and other bad faith actions, I think perhaps the best strategy here, as we outlined, is that use of those international systems with a more reaffirmed and a more stronger and more resourceful international body system, whether it's UN, et cetera. We think that would be a more, I guess, effective approach towards China's internal human rights abuses.
Great.
Are you willing to, did I ask Jim's question again? Are you, if that doesn't work, right, and they essentially say, we like some of these rules but not others, and who are you to tell us what the new international rules-based order looks like? We believe in the international rules-based order, but it's our international rules, not the ones that have traditionally been in place. Are you comfortable with that? Or what are the benefits, and we know what the benefits are. What are the risks that you anticipate, and are you willing to bite down hard and accept that may be the future? It'll be a rules-based order, but it won't be the traditional rules-based order. Is that okay?
We're willing to accept that possibility, and it does come with a bitter pill to swallow of maybe that means we can't, go yelling about something that we view as unjust, which is difficult. But we still believe it has a better chance of success on the issues we care about than conflict does.
I'm getting the sense that your team is not willing to take your argument to its logical conclusion. The logical conclusions are that China really isn't a threat, so we should reduce our military forces and not worry so much about the military competition in Asia. And we should let China do what it wants to domestically, because that really isn't central to U.S. national interest. Right? And we should try to strengthen international institutions, but not worry so much about whether China joins them or not. Right? Kind of leave China alone. Is that the real logical conclusion that I should take from your panel?
I think you have a lot of the logical direction correct. I think that we don't reach the same conclusion of totally abandon this region of the world because we do have strategic interest there in the form of South Korea and in the form of Japan. We do believe and follow the logic that you're sort of advocating for, but that doesn't mean we can't that doesn't mean we can entirely abandon Japan and South Korea and we can entirely go back on all of the commitments we've made to these countries. I think it is both true that we don't necessarily feel incredibly threatened and think China is a threat to the world order, and that we still want some checks and balances in place.
I think also part of the reason why we want to continue working with China is because we also have really important shared global challenges in the form of climate change, in the form of arms control and things like that. And so if we completely leave China to their own devices and don't try to get them engaged in bodies like the UN or other international bodies, then we're losing out on a massive opportunity to tackle these massive issues that do pose an existential threat to humanity.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Professor Jackson, and then hopefully we'll have time for Team B to ask a question of Team A, and Team A to ask one question of Team B. You should choose it very carefully and make it as succinct as possible.
Aren't you all being overly rosy when it comes to Taiwan? President Xi has said the Chinese military should be ready to assault Taiwan by 2027. Our own highest-ranking military officials have said that we should expect China to be ready to launch an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. So is the proposal that you're laying out here doing nearly enough? We're going to back off of freedom of navigation patrols operations and things like that? Is that not sending the wrong message to China when it seems like this should be more of a pressing concern to the United States than ever?
I think a big thing that a lot of people fail to consider is that when you're talking about defending Taiwan, there's no like dipping your feet in. There's no half in, half out. It's either you're all the way going to fight a direct war with China, or you have to pull out completely. Because in the event that China does try to invade Taiwan, they're going to set up a blockade. They're going to set up a no-fly zone. If the U.S. even tries to send weapons aid, China will probably sink that boat, shoot down that plane, and then the U.S. enters a hot war with China. And so I think for us, I think the best thing to do is sell Taiwan arms, try to arm them to the point where they're able to deter an invasion from China. But if China's going to invade Taiwan, they're going to do it anyways, and they're going to succeed anyways, because the U.S. military can't massively change its structure in just 4 years in 2027. All that stuff would have to go through Congress, and that would take years. So if China's going to invade, they're going to do it anyways, and we think that the best U.S. response is to not get ourselves entangled into a war with China, because that would be disastrous. It would kill lots of Americans, it would cost billions of dollars, and it would absolutely destroy the U.S. economy.
So at the end of the day, if China does decide to invade Taiwan, is that essentially advocating a policy of abandoning the island to its fate?
Not publicly, but yes. We're willing to sell defensive weapons to make sure that they have the best chance possible to stay independent on their own terms.
If that happens, then are you kind of switching course with your overall policy you're suggesting, or are you going to keep on keeping on even at that point, or is that a death blow to the strategy you're laying out here?
We talked about flexibility a lot earlier, and so in the event that China does take a militaristic or escalatory action like seizing Taiwan, then we have those extra troops in the Asia-Pacific region, we have our allies, and we're willing to re-ramp up our military presence in the region in case we get this wrong. And that's part of why we think our plan is so effective, is it provides us with the flexibility in case our assessments are not what happens in actuality.
We've drawn a pretty stark distinction between Chinese rhetoric and Chinese action. Chinese action of fully invading Taiwan would be a substantial aggressive and a substantial aggressive action, and that would, cause us to pivot and cause us to engage in one of the biggest strengths of our plan, which is flexibility. We'd still have the ability to contain China at that point if the need arises.
Just to be absolutely crystal clear, if China does invade Taiwan, do you in effect become Team B?
Yeah. I think there are specific points that we might disagree with, but yes.
Great, thanks. Okay.
Just by the by, before I ask a question,
Yes.
there have been another set of war games run on the other coast, or more recently, that can have rather different conclusions than Iran, just for your future edification.
Great, thank you. Peter. And keep the question relatively short, not a multi-part. Same rules apply to you guys from the time code?
10-part
All right.
question.
So a number of parts of your proposal are significantly increased engagement with our allies in the region through the Quad, as well as further economic and diplomatic engagement with those allies, and furthermore, the continuation of selling arms to Taiwan in order to assure their defense. These are all things that Xi Jinping and Beijing have claimed are threatening and provocative, and he no longer wants happening. So how do you reconcile the fact that you're pursuing these goals while hoping to engage with China, despite the fact that your central goals are still threatening to the CCP?
Yeah, so firstly, I'd say that the largest sources of Chinese concerns and this sort of perspective that the United States is posing a threat to them are being removed. So again, we're assuming a more defensive posture when it comes to our drills. We're also ceding over some policy considerations, whether it's in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. The second point is we're acting in good faith here. We're communicating to our allies that it's perfectly fine for them to engage with China, which again was a significant concern of theirs. They're fearful of an isolation campaign. That is not what we're advocating for. We're telling our allies to go ahead, communicate with China, open trade with them, do what you want as a sovereign actor, and that's a relationship that we're endorsing here. With regards to the Quad and AUKUS, there is strong potential that we're able to communicate with China while also maintaining our security agreements with the Quad and AUKUS. We can communicate with our internal actors in those organizations that we need to communicate with China. We're not necessarily saying that as we work with India or Japan or Australia, the UK, we're not communicating to them that we're not going to work together with or in contention with China here, we can devise a strategy to talk and communicate with China. We're also opening so many more, I guess, just avenues of engagement with China, whether that's through more cultural and social institutions, but we're also advocating for the use of international bodies here. Again, I just think we're welcoming of any sort of relationship between ourselves and our allies, and that will not necessarily get in the way of like pre-existing defense and security agreements here. It's all about maintaining fair and open communication, and again, because of the fact that we're acting in good faith with some more international and regional systems, we think that China will be willing to engage with the United States in that point that you raised there.
Thank you. Ben, would you like to ask your
Yeah,
team
we
question?
have sort of a two-part question.
Only two.
Unfortunately, only two. I think one of the largest differences between our two sides is how we perceive Chinese ideology and how they respond to our action. You guys somewhat assume that they are really aggressive right now, but they can be pacified through military action in the future. So our question is basically, what if your ideological read is wrong, as the first part, and as the second part, is there anything China could do to convince you that you are wrong about your read as an aggressive imperialist power that can sort of be restrained through only aggressive military action?
On the first part about the ideological read, I think it's interesting because it is clear that we have a difference. You guys said respect the ideology of China, and it's just something I don't think we're willing to do. To taking them at their word, as you said, is like the wolf warrior mentality. Domestic oppression cannot be challenged, and that the U.S. has no presence in the region. So that ideology is I mean, I think it's pretty well expressed. I don't think we're reading tea leaves too much to say that that's what they're communicating. And that's not something we're willing to accept. And on the second part about what it would take to be wrong is not having those advocations in territorial waters that or challenging our freedom of navigation. Provocative things that they're currently doing. If they weren't doing that, it would be evidence that they're less provocative.
I think another clear step they could make is stating explicitly that they're not willing to use military force to reunite with Taiwan. I think that would go a long way to sort of assuage concerns in the United States about significant military buildup, and would allow us to sort of form a foundation about which we can start to seriously talk about how can we work to accommodate China in the international system. But they're not willing to do that, and so we need to be able to take them at their word and meet their challenge.
Hey, I just want to thank both of our teams for truly wonderful presentations, and we're looking forward to two wonderful presentations this afternoon as well. So we'll take a break. We'll try and reconvene right around 1 o'clock, by which I mean we're going to get started at 1 o'clock. And thanks. We'll see you back here at 1 o'clock.